De nuevo, buenos días y buenas tardes a todos.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My name is Joshua Paternina Blanco, and I am the investigation officer at the ITF in the OECD. First of all, I would like to welcome you to our third session of this series of virtual conferences about decarbonizing transport in an unprecedented global crisis. Before giving the floor to Dr. Susanna Val, who will be the moderator for this event, I would like to give you some basic information on the context of this project and also technical information for the session. This series of virtual conferences are framed within the DTEE project. The idea of this project is to support the Argentina, India, Azerbaijan, and Morocco authorities in their efforts to decarbonize the transport in their respective countries. It is being carried out by the ITF and the Wuppertal Institute, and it is supported by the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety in Germany. Within the framework of the DTEE, this series of conferences is focusing on Argentina. And this is being organized by the ITF, the Wuppertal Institute, the Ministry in Argentina, Sustentar Foundation, and the Let's Global Partnership. You will see their logos on screen. The goal during the coming weeks will be to try and see how we can decarbonize transport in emerging economies in such a way that can also answer to other priorities in public policy that were highlighted after the COVID crisis. Some of these priorities might be to restart the economy, to develop transport systems which could be more resilient, and also to guarantee the essential transport services at the same time while taking care of the sanitary or health requirements related to the crisis. As you can see, this will last for 4 weeks, and we started yesterday, and this will finish on the 30th of July. We will have 9 open sessions, focusing mainly on the decarbonization of freight transport in their different modes. We will also discuss the relationship between the decarbonization of transport and the governance in transport, and also we will be discussing how to combine transport decarbonization together with a more sustainable territorial development. With regards to this session, decarbonizing road freight in times of crisis, we should think of the technical aspects of the session now. First of all, I have to say that this session, as the other public sessions, are being recorded. These recordings, together with the presentations, will be shared with you in a link that will be shared by my colleagues soon. Likewise, as you can see in this presentation, you have simultaneous interpretation into several languages. In this particular session, we have English, Spanish, and Portuguese. To benefit from the interpreting services in the best way, please choose your preferred language. We recommend not to mute the original audio, since if you do so, you might have complications to listen in a fluid way. Just remain in your preferred language and listen to the different presentations. Moreover, you can see a chat window where my colleagues will be sharing with you useful information that could be of your interest, so please pay attention to the chat window. Also, we have a Q&A icon that you can use to write your questions for everyone.
And showing the presentation full.
Okay,
Just
okay,
a note.
okay.
Sorry.
Thank you for that. No, don't worry. Um, Disculpen por el problema.
I'm sorry about the technical issue. I was just told that my slides were not changing. I don't know if you are seeing my slides now. Do you see any changes in the slides on the screen? Do you see them moving? Don't worry. In any case, I will just tell you once again the last technical data about the session. At the end of the session, after their presentation, panelists will be answering questions and we'll have this Q&A session that will be open. And we are going to have two colleagues that will be asking these questions, one from the IRU and the other one from the ICCT. I would like to invite you also to interact with us in the different spaces that we generated for the conference on Twitter and LinkedIn in order to share information that you might find relevant in this series of events using the hashtags that you will see next. Hashtag Descarbonización Transporte Argentina, hashtag Decarbonizing Transport Argentina. And now I would like to invite Dr. Susana Val to share her screen. But first, I would like to introduce her, Dr. Susana Val, who will be the moderator in this event, is an expert in road freight and urban logistics. She has more of 20 years of experience in the public and the private sectors in these topics, and currently, among other responsibilities, she is the director of the Zaragoza Logistics Center, an associated professor in the International Logistics Program in the MIT Zaragoza. She's also a researcher in the MIT. Now I will give the floor and the screen to Dr. Susana Ball. Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome also to this webinar session on decarbonizing transport in road freight in times of crisis. I will be the moderator of this session, and we are going to have top-notch panelists. First of all, I would like to thank all of the participants and speakers for their presence and the organizers, specifically the ITF, the Wuppertal Institute, the Ministry of Environment of Germany, and the cooperation, of course, of the Ministry of Transport in Argentina, Sustenter, and Let's Lag, that are making this conference cycle possible. Also, we are going to be discussing today a very important topic. We are going to explore how decarbonization policies in transport might promote a financial rebirth and how we can increase the capacity of the transport system in Argentina after the COVID-19 crisis. And we are going to see, too, how to increase resilience given the obstacles in the future, and how we can find opportunities to reduce emissions. I am going to do a brief introduction on the topic that we are going to be discussing today. Before giving the floor to the panelists, I will tell you that the road freight activities, especially in Argentina, are essentials. Imports and exports of products are the main engine of the country's economy. In those flows in Argentina, they have long distances and very complicated areas. Actually, road transport is responsible for most of the road freight in the country, and trucks have a quite high carbon intensity. Therefore, they are or represent the higher proportion of emissions in the transport sector. In terms of passenger and freight transport in Argentina, they are around 15% of the CO2 emissions in the country. More than 90% of these emissions come from road activities, being half of them produced by merchandise trucks. Private cars are second in terms of emissions, which is around 42% of the road transport emissions. Therefore, the decarbonization of transport is one of the main goals set in order to meet national goals. These decarbonization strategies in transport are also defined within the National Transport and Climate Change Plan, and they are planning to save 60% of emissions given the mitigation of emissions in merchandise transport. We all know that the COVID global crisis is creating a global challenge. And given the Argentine landscape, we need to take into account what is going to happen within the national initiatives in Argentina and also taking into account the budget limitations that were there before the pandemic. In this context, these decarbonization policies should allow the competitiveness of production and Argentine exports in this high uncertainty context, not only in the country but also at the global level. Another great challenge for Argentina is its size and geography. We might encounter obstacles in lack of organizational structure for effective decarbonization plans, and that's crucial. The coordination between the relevant sectors might be taken into account for all of the production chains so that these actions can be really successful. We have to pay attention also to the emissions related to the production of alternative fuels in the country. In terms of other ways of transport, the train sector has quite low speeds of 15 kilometers per hour with derailing risks, and this is why many companies choose trucks. To tell you some data, in 2018, 536 million tons of freight was transported in Argentina, and then more than 100 with other countries. The types of products changes according to the origin and destination, but around 70% of these products exported were raw materials or cereals. More than half of total exports were fuels and byproducts. And in Argentina, around 60% of the goods circulating with road freight came from mining. All these translated into emissions, we might say that they are around 45% of the CO2 emissions in Argentina in transport. Most of the volumes go from Buenos Aires to Rosario back and forth. As a specific in the road freight transport in Argentina, such as in Europe, there is an additional component, which is that the merchandise transport market is dominated by small companies of less than 5 vehicles. So this atomization of the market entails different challenges for decarbonization. Some of these challenges include more difficulties to implement regulations, as well as the promotion of improvements for vehicles. More than 80%, according to the statistics of the vehicles used, are medium to heavy weight vehicles up to 4 tons, and we also see low load levels, which shows a deficiency in transport, which increases the cost and the number of kilometers or travels made. There are different initiatives, many of them in Europe, such as multi-modality, horizontal cooperation through the use of a neutral agent, increasing then the load or freight factor of the vehicles, or the use of digitalization for a better integration of the supply chain in order then to reduce the emissions in the road freight. We might need investment for infrastructure in order to pave roads and other type of improvements. There were implemented at the national level different policies to increase the efficiency of vehicles through a pilot voluntary program of smart transport, and also there were regulatory measures promoted in order to use high-capacity vehicles. The estimated benefits include the reduction of cost up to $1.7 billion between 2019 and 2030, and also a decrease up to 14% of the total use of fuels in the same period, according to data from the Ministry of Transport in 2018. However, the use of high capacity or scalable vehicles is still lacking regulation, and it is subject to specific routes, such as in Spain, where we have a lack of highly trained staff to drive this type of vehicles, and this constitutes then an obstacle. We need to bear in mind short-distance transport. In Argentina, more than 90% of the population live in urban areas, and interregional trips are done mainly through road transport, including buses, and the emission then of vehicles in cities will increase according to these short-distance travels. Therefore, I believe that we are at the right time within the crisis to try and find opportunities to redesign and bet on new policies and measures that could allow us to generate an improvement within this global crisis. Of course, in Argentina, I mentioned some, but there are many others interesting initiatives related to road freight. There are projects being done within the Ministry of Environment in Germany and led by Wuppertal, where my company is involved in, and they show the interest to reduce carbon in the sector, specifically in Argentina. Other initiatives in the pursuit that I believe that are very important are what is called Paseo del Bajo, which is the connection between the southern highway with the port and then the north of the city, and this will reduce the trucks going through the city, and this allows us to mitigate emissions. I would say that the COVID-19 crisis has truly shown the need to assess the impact of road freight. Of course, we have to bear in mind the commitment not only of Argentina, but of every country in the world is to reduce emission. And therefore, throughout this session, we are going to be discussing different opportunities in terms of the crisis, the obstacles, and how to increase resilience in road freight. And to discuss this topic, we have great panelists that will be doing their presentation. First of all, I would like to introduce Alan McKinnon. Alan McKinnon is a logistics professor at Kuhn Logistics University and also an emeritus professor at Watt University. Over the past 40 years, he has published and done research extensively in road transport, international logistics, and its impact in climate change. He was also an advisor for governments, parliamentary committees, and international organizations around the world around these topics. Among other positions, he's been the director of the Logistics and Supply Chain Council of the World Economic Forum, and also he's a member of the European Commission's High-Level Group on Logistics. He's a graduate of the Universities of Aberdeen, British Columbia, and London. Today, he will make a great presentation on decarbonization on road freight in COVID times and how to combine different initiatives to foster the economy and increase resilience in these cases. Alan, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna, for that introduction. I'll just put my presentation on the screen. Good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to be contributing to this webinar. Perhaps I should say a word briefly about my university, which is located in Hamburg, and as the name suggests, it's a university which specializes in logistics. We are a private state accredited university, which will be celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. As time is limited, I'm going to keep this presentation fairly tight. I'm going to begin by actually referring to some of the modelling work that's been done by the International Forum. Some of you may have noticed that a few weeks ago, they published the results of an analysis of the effect of COVID-19 on freight traffic levels measured in ton kilometres and the related CO2 emissions. But as I'm a regular reader of ITF reports, I noticed that there were some similarities between the statistics that they came up with. So the most recent report suggested that the impact of COVID worldwide on all transport modes would be to reduce ton kilometres by just over a third, 36%, and related CO2 emissions would come down by about 28%. But in last year's Transport Outlook report, they indicated that in their current ambition scenario for the period 2015 to 2030, they were anticipating a 30% reduction in CO2 emissions from freight transport worldwide. And the 28% figure and the 30% figure look very similar. It suggests that COVID has essentially delivered about 15 years worth of freight decarbonisation within a matter of months. But of course, as we know, that's only going to be temporary. We're now going to see a rebound in the level of freight activity. It's difficult to know how quickly freight levels will recover and also the extent to which they will recover. Also worth pointing out that this recent modelling exercise by ITF doesn't split down the ton kilometres and CO2 emissions by transport mode. But of course, as we know, road is by far the main source of freight-related CO2 emissions worldwide. But my focus here very much is on the road freight sector. The German development agency, GIZ, a few weeks ago published a blog in which they posed this question: will the corona crisis help or hurt the freight decarbonisation agenda? There's the link if you want to consult it. And what they did was they built an argument around a framework which I use in my book on decarbonising logistics, because it seems to me that everything we can do to decarbonise freight transport falls within 5 categories. Some interventions would reduce demand for freight transport, others will shift freight to lower carbon transport modes, some will improve the utilisation of freight capacity, some will improve energy efficiency of freight vehicles, and then the final one will be switching to lower carbon energy sources. And so I've really built this short presentation around these 5 sets of initiative. Looking at the first one, which is reducing the future demand for road freight transport, there's been historically a very close correlation between road ton kilometres and GDP. And I think we're all expecting the global economy now to plunge into a fairly deep post-COVID recession. So GDP levels will drop, and almost certainly the demand for road freight will drop. But again, the expectation is that that will be temporary. What might be a longer term effect is possibly a change in patterns of consumption, because people's experience of COVID and the radical change in lifestyle which they've experienced during lockdown may change people's consumption patterns. It may be people more responsible consumers, which may reduce the amount of stuff that gets moved. But I've got a question mark there. I mean, that I think is really hard to predict. If we look at 3D printing, which if it develops as a major technology, could reduce the ton kilometers. The use of 3D printing has certainly been boosted by its emergency deployment in the health sector in particular, but other sectors. So I could see there'll be possibly a step change in the use of 3D printing, which again might affect future ton kilometers. But the other thing is, and this is a point that was made yesterday by Jean-Paul Rodriguez in his presentation, and also by Susanna, the fact that companies in the future may attach more importance to resilience rather than efficiency in the way that they manage their supply chains. And the line of reasoning is that may encourage more localized sourcing of products, which would then reduce supply lines and would reduce the total amount of freight movement. But I would caution on this one. For one thing, we should be aware of the fact that it's possible to have fairly long haul supply chains and yet still improve their resilience in other ways. For example, by building up inventory levels, improving transparency, building in more redundancy. Another thing is we shouldn't underestimate the strength of the economic forces pushing for long distance sourcing and also the centralization of production and inventory. These forces remain strong. And then my final point on this topic is to say that localizing production and sourcing doesn't necessarily reduce total emissions. If we look at the life cycle emissions in products, the freight-related emissions are only a small percentage of that. So we might cut the freight-related emissions, but at the end of the day, increase total emissions. So we have to be very careful on that argument. But one other major thing that's happened during the crisis is we've seen this, what I call a COVID-reinforced surge in the demand for online retailing. Now, of course, that was a well-established trend already underway. Before the crisis began, the World Economic Forum and McKinsey published a report in which they predicted that across the world's 100 largest cities, there would be about a 1/3 growth in emissions from last mile deliveries of online orders. That figure will have to be raised, it seems to me, in the light of what's happened in recent months. So it raises the question, to what extent will this shift, this step change in the use of online retailing, help us to decarbonize the road freight sector? Now, to answer that question, you've got to look at road freight in general, because we'll see a reduction in van traffic. So we'll see an increase in van traffic, but that hopefully will be offset by some reduction in the amount of shopping-related car travel. So we have to take a holistic view, in a sense, of the effects of online retailing on road transport in urban areas. Now, this is a much researched subject. I've contributed to that research myself. And regrettably, I don't think we yet have a definitive answer to the question at a macro level as to whether the shift to online retailing increases or reduces total CO2 emissions. One thing we can say, however, is that there are a number of interventions that can be applied to last mile deliveries, which would significantly decarbonize those operations. And indeed, they are discussed in the World Economic Forum McKinsey study that was published earlier this year. So that's my first set of initiatives. The second one relates to the potential for shifting freight away from the road sector towards lower carbon transport modes, and thinking here in particular of rail and water-based transport. But if we take a global perspective on that, I mean, what we find is that the share of the market held by rail and waterborne transport has either been stable, or in many countries it's been declining. So if one looks at the US, for example, or across Europe, you find stability really in modal split. So the question is, to what extent will the COVID crisis alter those trends? Well, in Europe, I think the rail freight sector has come out of the COVID crisis quite well. That the rail freight operators, I think, have performed well. I think their reputation has been enhanced, and one might expect that to translate into a more competitive position in the future, but that's yet to be determined. If we look at the United States, McKinsey published a report just a few weeks ago where they posed the same question. I mean, to what extent is COVID going to affect the freight modal split in the US? And they claimed that the main determinant of that will be the commodity mix that's handled by the different transport modes. They classified commodities in terms of the speed with which they are likely to recover from the COVID crisis. And then they looked at the proportions of those commodities carried by the different transport modes. And on that basis, they concluded that the COVID crisis will actually favor trucking operations. As you can see, the trucking sector handles a much larger proportion of these faster return commodities than inland waterway rail or even air cargo. Now, I don't know to what extent we can generalize on that and to what extent that will apply to other countries, but it does suggest that potentially the road freight sector may be the main beneficiary of this. My third category of initiative relate to the utilization of vehicle capacity. Now, what we have seen in recent months is the demand for road freight services dropping at a faster rate than the reduction in the capacity in the sector. And that's then been reflected, I think, in a reduction in the average load factors of vehicles. The other thing which has happened is we've seen a dislocation of supply chains, which has made it harder for carriers to achieve high levels of backloading. And that will have exacerbated the empty running problem. But to some extent, these will both be temporary developments. Looking to the longer term, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the likelihood of just-in-time pressures being relaxed. This is because, as I mentioned earlier, companies perhaps giving greater priority to the resilience of supply chains. I mean, there was an article in the Financial Times recently which said that companies should now be moving away from just-in-time towards a just-in-case approach. Now, if that were to happen, it could result in some improved utilization of truck capacity, because just-in-time is frequently blamed for the underloading of vehicles. But again, I would exercise some caution on this, because if we're looking at the effects of just-in-time on logistics related CO2 emissions, again, we've got to adopt a holistic approach. Because if we relax just-in-time, it may increase vehicle load factors and reduce CO2 emissions in the road freight sector, but it could well increase energy use and emissions in production operations, in logistics more generally. And so we've really got to do a much broader assessment before we could say that's going to cut emissions overall. Another thing which I think has been affected by COVID is the level of supply chain collaboration, because there's wide acknowledgement these days that for the logistics sector to achieve the really deep reductions in emissions that we require by 2030 and 2050, we will have to see much more collaboration between companies and sharing assets. Now, I just cite this as one example of improved collaboration during COVID. Here in the UK, where I'm based at the moment, there was actually a new collaboration group established involving 20 large grocery and household appliance manufacturers, where they worked together to coordinate their supply chain operations during the COVID crisis. Now, this was not done explicitly to improve transport efficiency, but the fact that companies are working together hopefully will translate longer term into improved load sharing. And then the third thing I will mention here is digitalization. Again, it's been a very pronounced trend in logistics. I think there's general agreement that its net effect is to reduce the carbon intensity of transport. And the feeling is that the COVID crisis has helped to accelerate that uptake of digital technologies. And my expectation is that that will, again, improve the utilization of logistics assets. And again, to give a concrete example of that, here in Europe, some of the online freight exchanges have been offering their free load matching services free of charge during the COVID crisis. And the expectation is that companies that are now choosing to use those load matching services to backload their vehicles, for example, that they will see the benefit in using these services and may continue to do so after the crisis is over. And then my final slide relates to, I've actually combined two sets of initiatives related to energy. One is improving energy efficiency, and the other is reducing the carbon content of the energy that is used. And very hard to say what the net effect is going to be in this case, because there are conflicting forces here, and it's hard to see how they will resolve themselves. So on the negative side, we've seen a dramatic reduction in the oil price in recent months, and the projection is that the oil price will now remain relatively low for some time in the future, maybe somewhere in the range of $40 to $50 a barrel. And that is going to make it harder for companies to justify making energy efficiency improvements, and also will make it difficult for companies to justify switching from low cost fossil fuel to perhaps higher cost electrical energy or biofuels or whatever. Another negative development here is that clearly many road freight carriers are in a difficult financial position. It's a sector that operates generally on very low margins. Carriers are constantly struggling to survive. That's going to be even more difficult in this post-COVID world. There may be less capital available then for green investment. They'll probably extend the vehicle lives. The replacement cycle will slow. And so the switch to lower emission vehicles may therefore be delayed. And then related to that, I mean, clearly governments are now heavily indebted, and it may be they'll be allocating less resources to green freight investment. So that's all on the negative side. There are positives, however. One positive, I think, would be to see governments withdraw or reduce their fossil fuel subsidies. The IEA estimated that last year, I think $318 billion were spent by 40 countries worldwide subsidizing the use of fossil fuel, much of that diesel, much of it going into freight vehicles. So now we've got a low oil price, high indebtedness on the part of government. So it seems to me the conditions are now conducive to a reduction in those fuel subsidies. Another thing which is encouraging, that quite a few big logistics companies have declared recently that they're remaining committed to their carbon reduction targets despite COVID. Now, of course, that isn't just for environmental reasons. One of the good things about decarbonisation is that many of the carbon reducing measures will cut cost as well as cut CO2 emissions. So that many of the companies will be doing this, I think, as much for commercial reasons as for environmental reasons. Another thing which I find encouraging, that those governments that have got fuel economy standards for trucks and vans, like in Europe and North America, have decided to retain them despite the COVID crisis. And then this is my final point, that governments are obviously interested now in finding ways of rebuilding their economies and creating jobs and so forth. The hope is that they will see freight-related green investment as being a way of doing that, in things like building recharging networks for battery-operated vehicles. Here in Europe, there's growing interest in electrifying highways. We'll also need gas filling stations, or perhaps for hydrogen and so forth. These would be fairly labor-intensive activities, and hopefully some of that government pump priming money will go into these things. So at the end, my final conclusion is that, whatever the extent to which COVID contributes to further decarbonisation of the road freight sector will partly depend on government action. And one hopes that they will be enlightened and do this in a way that actually helps to cut carbon intensity across the road freight sector. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Alan, por tu interesante ponencia.
Thank you, Alan, for your interest presentation. And now I would like to introduce the next panelist, Gaston Jacquez. He is currently the Secretary of Transport Planning in the Transport Ministry of Argentina. Before being appointed to this position, he held several positions in the public administration sphere. He also has extensive experience in the development of freight transport and logistics projects. Gaston will tell you a little bit about the current situation in Argentina. Gaston, thank you very much.
Hola, nada que decirle. Buen día, buenas tardes a todos.
Good morning, everyone. I am very happy to do this presentation because we believe this is crucial for what is happening with road freight in the long term. We already started with Minister Meoni from the very first day to plan what we are doing for the future.
Ustedes entiendan la situación actual del transporte de carretera en el país. Como todos saben, el sistema de transporte automotor de cargas en Argentina está desregulado desde 1996 a través de la Ley 24.653.
We have a law regulating transport in this country with certain requirements. We need to take into account that these requirements are not always met, and we should see what is going on in border situations as well. For example, the problem with independent borders, or when producers have their own trucks and they are producing or transporting for third parties, and also international transport, and when they're coming back, they decide to do national transport as well.
Tarifa y eso se ajusta en precarización. En esa situación, sumada a la crisis económica que viene de los años anteriores, se encontraba el transporte automotor de cargas cuando en el mundo se declaró la pandemia del COVID-19.
This is a situation that we had when the world had the COVID pandemic. This is essential for the supply of population. This is why road freight did not suffer any problems with COVID in terms of obstacles, but there were other obstacles related to some local situations or business people that put their own obstacles. And let me tell you about the measures that we implemented. In April this year, MEONE, the Ministry of Transport, signed an agreement with YPF to open 260 gas stations so that the truckers could load fuel and get change and eat. And this was very important for Argentina in order to have real observations of what is happening with road freight in our roads. These stopping areas are going to include new technology in order to see how we can improve the situation. Finally, in June, the Ministry of Transport reached the necessary transports to see what will happen with the Ministry of Transport itself and also ministries of Agriculture, Health, and the National Direction of Migrations. We have a clear protocol so that the local authorities cannot intervene with the national regulations. And let me give you an example. In some cases, they wouldn't allow the truck drivers to go into certain places. These are just examples where the ministry had to intervene, and together with the trade union of drivers and the transport chambers, we had to work together in order to allow the supply for the different populations. And the good thing is that we were able to have a logistics panel coming from the surveys that we had, and also taking into account the companies of bioethanol and biodiesel. And for the different products, we were able to make estimations from data from the national level and from some transport chambers. Even though we had an interaction that in not every case was very good, we still were able to maintain the activity of the road freight in grains at the same levels in 2019. This is why we are giving some of these company credits for the renewal of their trucks. The idea is for them to switch into better transport systems with lower emissions.
El resto de las actividades vinculadas
We
a
also need to bear in mind that other activities related to road freight were affected by the restrictions that we had due to COVID. The activities in the logistics sector was reduced for some products, while for some others, like e-commerce, were increased. In the rest, there were reductions,
el 31% de los viajes de larga
which
distancia.
were quite heterogeneous. In general lines, the logistic activity fell 31%, and the transport of beverages was reduced 26%. The most affected sectors are those related to the car industry, painting, siderurgy, home appliances, materials and construction inputs, general freights, fuels, etc. And we could say that the sector felt the impact of the pandemic in this regard. And the modal participation of freights was not only reduced, it went from 92 to 93% of participation. And we can take, or we should see, what is happening in Argentina. We need to have real data about transport in Argentina in order to really plan what to do from now on. And this is what we are working on now, on getting the right data and surveys in order to know what to do. First of all, we need to have, or we are trying to get all the surveys in place in order to know how many vehicles we have. What we see in these slides is the number of cars and trucks that we have. We need to know how we have trucks and pickups. So we need to learn what are the real numbers that we have. We know that this sector is heterogeneous, but we know that many of these companies are only small companies having 2 or 3 vehicles. And this is related to what we have in Argentina with our federal law of traffic.
Me están pidiendo que disminuyas un poco el ritmo para poder hacer la traducción. Gracias.
Bueno, bárbaro. Como decía, bueno, en el sector consisten empresas.
As I was saying, there are some companies that are incorporating new information technology and some workers with their own tools that cannot survive in this crisis. And this related to the crisis in Argentina. This led to having the requirements of the federal transit law to be delayed. This was for all the merchandise that were not dangerous. Old engines contaminate more, but what can we do with all the families that own those type of vehicles? Our economy, typical of emerging countries, has to pivot between what is happening with the emissions and the social situation as well. This is why the fleet renovation is a crucial pillar that must be fostered. The way to do it is to have the right measures in place. And now to tell you a little bit more about the previous government, I shall tell you a little bit about what we have right now. We have buy trains and scalables. We need to see what happened in the past and what happens now. What happens with the scalability and its perspective too. In effect, if we can have a tandem or a combination in the different systems, we could improve the situation. Together with the Transport Regulation Commission and the Association of Engineers and other technical associations, we are trying to see the procedures approved in 2019 because we believe that the current situation in Argentina does not match the previous plans of the previous administration. This is why we plan to have an updated handbook for next year so that we can really match the data that we obtained after the last surveys. What we can see here in these slides is the fuel savings and how we can really solve or improve the situation. We should see that this does not only include the combination of the different modes, but we need to think of what is happening in terms of distances, versatility, and making the transport system work as an integrated set and not individually. The new information technology, the capacity to link empty trucks coming back with other loads and optimizing the movements is one of the pillars in the desired transformation. We want for this not to be only a log, but for this to be really a good tool based on big data. Now, in terms of our role in the Secretariat, we want to do the following actions. Move forwards in the knowledge of the sector, which is limited, logging and the characteristics of the types of vehicles, tariffs, products transported, cost estimation, and profitability. We also need to study the incidence in logistic costs affecting the economy and proposing improvement alternatives as a combination with other modes, logistic centers, reduction of waiting times, working also with industry and environment in order to foster more efficient and less contaminant vehicles. We would also like to develop mechanisms to foster practice of smart transport, and also we need to translate into legal instruments what we believe is relevant. In terms of moving forward with the knowledge in the sector, we believe that this is related to the regulatory reformulation, the technological update, and also having a new unique log of the car transport, what we call ruta. This was implemented in 2002, but what we see here is that there is a stagnation in data because the numbers that we are finding these days are not very accurate. This is why we are carrying out our own surveys in order to obtain more results, because having the same results now as 17 years ago is not a good sign. So this ruta log shall include information about vehicles, companies, and everything related to transport, waiting times, rates, tariffs, etc. This should be a universal database, completely unified, in order to be able to develop our incentive regime after this, because I believe that everyone in the car and transport sector should be included. In terms of multimodality implementation, we must say that throughout a long time, people believed that it was only in the books, but multimodality is done through mobile and fixed structure. And the road that we have started in our administration is related to roll on, roll off, and we are doing this through the Southern Maritime Corridor in order to relieve Route 3, what we call the Ferropista. The idea is to have special trains so that we can reduce the number of trucks. We also would like to have freight unitarization, currently in bulk, in containers, and also we would like to have central stations for freights. In the case of the province of Salta, they are moving forward, and the idea is to work in the different areas of the country, especially with exports, and to articulate with river ports. Let me tell you about the savings. With the Southern Maritime Corridor, we could have savings of 100,000 tons of CO2 per year, and the implementation of trains for 500 trucks per day, considering only Monday to Friday, would imply an environmental saving of more than 3.2 million tons of CO2 per year. I'm sorry if I went too fast and if I spoke for too long, but I wanted to tell you how we are working in our sector so that road freight could be of vital importance for the development of our country. I think that it is important for all of us to include all of the stakeholders that are involved in the sector. We are now handling this situation, but we should all sit on the table in order to be able to join our efforts, especially of those that already have a presence in the sector for a long time. Thank you very much for your time and for your invitation. Thank you, Gaston, for telling us about the initiatives and the transport plan in Argentina. Now we are going to Julio Velasquez. He is the general manager of FADEC Argentina. He is a specialist in multimodal transport, railways, trucks, buses, and private vehicles. He has a degree in administration and economics from the University of Buenos Aires and holds a master's degree in strategic and technological management from the Technological Institute of Buenos Aires. Julio worked as a controller in railway and subway operating companies, as corporate manager in a business group of long-distance and medium-distance bus company, and since 2016 he has served as general manager of the Argentine Federation of Business Entities of the Freight Transport of Argentina, an entity affiliated with the Inter-American Chamber of Transport and the International Union of Roads based in Geneva. Julio will now give us his perspective from the industry sector in terms of what is happening with road freights right now. He will tell us about the challenges for road freight and how to combine different solutions for the economic recovery and in turn mitigating emissions. Julio, you have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to the International Forum Transport. It was a pleasure to share this table with such distinguished speakers. Thank you, Susanna. I'll make my presentation. Please let me know if I'm too fast so that our interpreters can work into the other languages. Okay. I would like to introduce to you this topic, which is so important, the decarbonization of freight transport in COVID-19. FADEC is an institution with 45 chambers in the whole country, organized at the federal level. It is part of IRU and CIT. We participate in tax revenue in Argentina, in the customs. We represent 80% of transport and logistics in Argentina. Is a very important number for us to consider. Our academic arm is the Professional Foundation for Transport, with 165 schools in the whole country, 197 professors, 84 teachers in hazardous cargo, 250,000 training courses per year. Within this institution, we are working in the Green Belt or Rango Verde policy. We are committed to decarbonization. Among other actions we consider, we would like to give a brief introduction to the Green Belt or Rango Verde. 94% of cargo, as it was previously stated, are transported by road. We are quite similar to what happens in Chile, and well, in Brazil we know cargo is widely distributed, but road transport is more compensated with railway and also by maritime. We have 55% of consumption of diesel in our country. You can see in this chart from 2010 until now. Nowadays, we are between the degree 2 or 3 of diesel. Maybe other people from other countries don't understand, because this is something that we created, the level 2 or degree 2. Because of the cost of the diesel degree 3, it is imported. This generates great CO2 emissions. So within our program, our goal was to decrease this by 5%. And only 5% of those millions that have been historically consumed is a number that we consider to be very important to bear in mind. And it is completely doable nowadays with our powerful sources. As regards our fleet, there are a few differences, and this has to do with our registers. For example, the road and not road. Road, because these are vehicles that conduct interjurisdictional transportation from one province to the other or from one state to the other. If I don't need to do that interjurisdictional transport, I don't need to take a route. For example, in Córdoba or Santa Fe province or Buenos Aires province, they have a great grain cargo matrix, and they can do that within the same province. So that will be no route. So we try that the 127,000 vehicles that we have in terms of this chart, we expect that in less than in 30 years, we can have 60,000 vehicles more. This will be our motor vehicles. I'm not talking about the non-motor vehicles. This is very important for us to consider, because there's a great obsolescence of the fleet, and it is also important to establish a fleet renewal strategy. And we have a very heavy tax load that it's not friendly with the carbon emissions reduction. We have 36.1% of long distance taxes, 41.8% in short distance, 37.4% in multiple services in a short and long distance. And this inefficiency in the tax matrix makes it very hard for us to convert if we don't have a specific support in this sense. The pandemic's problem, well, we have already reduced several activities, specifically in the automobile industry, oil industry. We have, for example, activities that are still very active, farming, food, uh, alive animals. In our country, the national executive power executes controls so that we can avoid the expansion of COVID, but every province established their own criterion, and it's not a general criteria. And unfortunately, the virus reached our drivers. There are, for example, ways that are completely shut down. The cost of a vehicle that cannot work per day is $70 per day. So, for example, between the provinces of Jujuy and Salta, there is a truck that has to wait 18 hours. If you multiply that by $70 per truck, costs increase very rapidly. There are also serological controls. Argentina have like $80 cost per study, and we know that it should be considered from the point of view of the healthcare sector, and not transport. But as regards sustainability and our Green Belt proposal, we have four specific aspects: infrastructure, human resources, compliance, and technology. This is very important in an emerging country, in a country that is growing: compliance, governance. As you know, Argentina implemented this and is very important for us. For example, the resources management, which are very scarce, so we need to apply them effectively and correctly. In terms of infrastructure, we have our national cargo matrix, which is strictly for primary production. As we said at the beginning, here we say 60% of our matrix, 40% is in the province of Buenos Aires. Within that 40% in the province of Buenos Aires, that will be vehicles in our routes. So that's 78% that they transport grain. The mining industry will be 28%. Grains 25%, and Cordova province represents 41%. Those vehicles, as I mentioned before, they only do transportation within the province of Cordova. They don't need to get out of the province. Those are the oldest vehicles, for example, that we have. Taking this into account, we understand that multimodal transport is necessary. We cannot conceive multimodal transport without a regional integration. For example, Chile or Brazil, which are countries that produce energy and food. So we will need to work within them cross-border wise. We are great producers of food. So in FADIAC, we are working in by ocean ways, especially with Brazil and Chile, with private companies. For example, we are planning a Copiapó-Sao Paulo corridor or other corridors. We take into account not only the truck, but we also need to take into account a competitive framework, a highly competitive framework, because trucks bear with 40% of a tax load. So, for example, truck companies had to bear with the whole activity, but the railway operator does not have that tax imposition. So there's a resistance in the truck companies, as it happens in our country, which is the American, they oppose to the American model, which is the railway model. As regards vehicle technology, this is something scalable. We would like to convey more efficiency to our fleet, taking into account or considering the vehicles that we do have. How can we achieve more efficiency at a lesser cost? There are different scalability measures that we are studying in our program. Nowadays, I would like to start with the second chapter, which is energy. This is what we understand that should happen with our cargo vehicles in the next few years. The coexistence and understand also the transition fuel energies. We understand that N1, these are diesel vehicles. Some others are electric vehicles or CNG vehicles. We understand that this will be developed over time. We understand that in the midterm, N1, like in CNG vehicles, that will be the alternative. And in the long run, electrical vehicles will be imposed in this kind of transport, which is the 1 mile vehicle. In the case of N2, which are the medium-sized vehicles, we understand that diesel nowadays is the fuel of choice, but there's an alternative to diesel, which is biodiesel. I understand that between 5 and 10 years, we could reduce emissions with biodiesel. There's 100% decrease in emissions if we compare biodiesel versus diesel. The same happens between CNG and biodiesel. What do I want to say with this is that we can propose an alternative fuel in Argentina to CNG. In Argentina, this is taking place already in Vaca Muerta, and we don't need to deforestate without jeopardizing the food security at the global level. This will allow us to supply the whole market, conveying this transition very gradually. In case of N3, I'm always asked about this. Why not electrical vehicles at this time and CNG or heavy load vehicles, for example, a bus that can carry 50 people and they have like a 500 drag force. So we understand that we need another kind of power related to the drag of these vehicles. In the midterm, we understand that biodiesel will coexist as a transition vehicle with LNG and CNG. And in the short term, we should include it, especially in N3. We should work this. And in the long term, if we understand hydrogen as an alternative, we do not discard it. We are working towards developing this. This is one of our greatest projects. We have 22 trucks in Argentina currently working with biodiesel, and we'll validate this in a few years' time. Excuse me, Julio, I will request you to sum up because we are only 1 minute left. Thank you. Okay, as regards vehicle technology, let me go as fast as I could. At a circular economy level, we can work with NFU for void fleets. For example, tires that are not being used currently. We are working in this productive unit to reduce the cost of the inverse logistics of this waste. As regards human resources, in Argentina, we have approximately 850,000 people that are employed in this. and we consider this is important, taking into account the health of our drivers, not only in terms of occupational health, but also in terms of COVID-19. We are worried. We are working with the protocol with all the provinces so that we can be safe and our drivers can be safe. And let me finish with compliance and transparency of processes. In general, this is important for us. So what do we expect from this pandemic? We understand that poverty will escalate approximately 7% or 7 percentile points from 26% to 34%. This will increase inequality. We believe that the increase of the use of management technologies of transport resources will be considerable. We understand that as a food-producing country and an energy-producing country, we should need to finance our road infrastructure and to renew our vehicles so that they are more sustainable with cleaner energies. Our taxes represent 3.7 or of the GDP, so we will need to increase our investment. We should also reconvert our public investment, to boost productivity and environmental sustainability. And of course, we should streamline the relation between the state, the population, and the market. Thank you very much for your attention to my presentation. I hope to have made myself clear. Thank you very much, Julio, for your point of view. We have several questions because you have touched very important points. Now I will introduce the next panelist, Carla Gonzalez Carabajal, the Transport Global Practical Manager in the World Bank. She has worked in sustainable development, gender equality, sustainability, mobility. Before taking her actual role, she worked in the global transport management in the World Bank. She's the leader of the gender working group, and she works with the gender agenda for the transportation sector. Before starting her career in the World Bank, she was the Vice Minister of Transport and Work, Publics and Transport Minister in Costa Rica. She studied in San Diego University, and she's a doctor in law from University in Costa Rica. Carla will introduce us to the technology in transport and her regional approach.
Gracias. ¿Me escuchas y
I give you the floor.
pantalla?
Sí, la pantalla todavía no, te escuchamos bien.
Can you hear me okay? Can you see my screen?
Okay.
Not yet.
No sé por qué, pero la tengo puesta en el modo que se supone que tiene que estar.
I don't know why you are not seeing my screen. Let me try again. Maybe someone can share your screen.
Sí, o la puedo compartir yo misma.
Or maybe I can share your presentation. Let me check.
Vamos a ver si ahora la puedo subir. ¿La puedes ver ahora?
Sí, ahora sí.
Can you see my screen now? Yes. Great.
Ya. Perfecto.
Very good.
Yo voy a hablar en inglés porque la preparé en
I
inglés.
will be speaking in English because I prepared my presentation in English. If I had known, I would have done it in Spanish, but now I'll switch to English.
8% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. So more than a third of all transport emissions and a full 75% of freight transport emissions. Therefore, it's an essential component of transport decarbonization efforts. Trucking accounts for the majority of national freight tonnage in most countries. So with this, what we're saying is that the dominance of the sector is unlikely to change for the foreseeable future. However, reducing the carbon footprint of truck-based logistics will entail a combination of efficiency gains through at least the medium term, and eventually, as we have heard from other panelists, a transition towards decarbonization over the long term. The efficiency gains are likely to be part of 4 different components of the logistics and trucking chain. The first one, of course, the standards, so carbon emission standards and reduction targets. The second one is related to the trucking or the trucks itself, all the specifics and the technology that we can bring out of this exercise. The other one is related to the transport management systems, which are absolutely critical in the case of large fleets. And then, of course, the driver. There are plenty of efforts around the world that shows that training can increase fuel efficiency significantly. One more thing is promoting the intermediation of trucking to reduce the empty, to reduce the empty miles driven. Now, these efficiency gains are kind of in the transition, as we have heard from other panelists. But if we really want to go into zero emission powertrains, we have to talk about, of course, battery electric trucks and other type of fuel cell trucks as hydrogen. But most importantly, we would like to talk about what Professor McKinnon was sharing, which is the electric road system, which is a catenary system like a railway that are currently being planned by Germany, and that we hope that we are going to see very soon in a type of corridors. Having said all of this, unfortunately, the decarbonization agenda as such is going to have maybe a slowdown based on the fact that the fuel prices are even going down. So if this is going to be the case, then the carbon taxation and other type of incentives are going to be much more needed. If this is not going to be the case, we know for a fact that at least within the next 10 years, we are not going to be seeing decarbonization in a big way or in a scale way. Now, there are different actors in the trucking industry that can play different roles in this transition. And all of them are critical: shippers, carriers, and governments. But maybe one of the most important ones for us at the MDBs, it's the role related to public interest, the role that governments and other NGOs can play to ensure that we will go steadily into decarbonization. In that sense, there are 3 things that we would like to underline. First, the importance of adopting carbon emission targets and introduce mandatory industry standards for truck engines and tailpipe emissions, compliance with the NDCs, develop incentive programs for fleet renewal, and definitely provide basic R&D to make sure that there will be development of new powertrain technology. And the last one, and it's not the least one, is multimodal transport, which I'm not going to extend based on the fact that we have heard a lot during the previous interventions. Now, when we talk about precisely a framework to go into decarbonization, we believe that efficiency, as I just mentioned it, is critical, but also resilience. And COVID-19 has tested the operational resilience of global trucking markets, making the case for further the promotion of multimodalism. One of those options is, of course, rail intermodal. And despite the fact that during the pandemic, we have seen a lot of drivers. Even pre-pandemic, there was a huge issue with drivers around the world. During the pandemic, we saw a big chunk of population out of drivers losing their jobs, 80,000 during March in US. And at the same time, we saw a very flexible or a rebounds that came late in June with more than 30,000 that were rehired. So they lost their jobs, but at least half of them have been rehired. So we see that this industry, although prone to all kind of difficulties, it's very much flexible and can become much more resilient using both things. Of course, using a complementary through the multimodalism, but also paying further attention to bringing jobs back to the market. This is particularly important. We heard about social issues all over the world, but this is particularly important in Latin America, in Mexico, Brazil, and based on what I just heard from the government, of course, in Argentina. Now, the other way to use or to bring resilience to the sector is through efforts to bring bulk commodities out of trucks to rail freight, which is also very important as an option. Having said all of this, we believe that it's particularly important to understand that there is a tension that COVID is bringing between agendas that before COVID were no-brainers. So for instance, now we are talking about resilience in the sector through jobs, let's say, trying to use rail service that will require fewer people to move the same amount of freight. On the other hand, we also know that we need to go through important patterns for job creation. Another tension that we are hearing from COVID-19 is the one related to the use of initiatives to build back better. So these initiatives, they really want to bring greener agendas to the table. At the same time, we need to pay attention to the efficiency and the productivity that needs to come back to the world. So at the end of the day, what we want to say is that despite the or because of the importance of the climate change agendas, we need to pay further attention to ways to gain let's say, the balancing act between the social agendas, the efficiency agendas, the resilience frameworks, but without forgetting the importance of the social platform in which all of this needs to work. And at the end of the day, COVID-19, it's a greater opportunity for going further into decarbonization, provided that we, like I said before, we paid attention to the balancing act between what appears to be conflicting agendas in this recovery phase that we are having. Let me stop here.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Carla. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Carla, very much. Thank you to all panelists for your interesting comments. I'm sure that this will create a very important debate in the Q&A session. But before going to the Q&A session, I would like to present two short interventions. First, Aldo Velasquez, Senior Technical Manager at the IRU, who will give us a vision about the recovery of road freight. Aldo, thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, and good morning all, and good afternoon. Aldo Celasco, Head of Technical Affairs in IRU, which is the International Road Union Organization. I want to give you a few sentences, as you said, on this virtual conference organized by ITF on a so important item, which is, again, decarbonizing road freight in time of crisis. In RU, the International Road Transport Organization, we are the voice of more than 3.5 million companies operating in mobility and logistics service, and we want to lead solutions to help the world move better. I would like to give you a few indications on our latest study that we have published. It is definitely called the COVID-19 impact on commercial road transport. As you are all aware, road transport industry is one of the most sector impacted by COVID-19. It has seriously affected transport operator in terms of finances, including revenue and cash flow, and moving many companies also even close to bankruptcy. In our report, the most important key figures that I want to share are the following. Good transport losses globally are expected to exceed more than 500 billion euro, even with the annual turnover down minus 18%. Just to give some number in terms of regional area, in Argentina, for instance, as we are related to this country, we have investigated a crisis with more than 30% of decline in business with specific companies. On the other side, on passenger transport sector, losses in Europe are expected to exceed 80 billion euro and an annual revenue down more than 57%. We have examples, for instance, in Europe where coach tourism, intercity application have lost more than 80% of activities and service. So you can imagine the COVID-19 affect strongly many companies. Again, in a country level, I can report you briefly different countries, and the effect is a general range of about minus 70% of decline. So in our study, we gave a snapshot of a detailed report assessing the impact of passenger and freight transport sector. We have interviewed our members. Those belong to 77 countries and around 6 continents. So again, RU is a global organization and we collect global data from all the regions in the world. To give to my conclusion in the report that I'm happy to share with you after the call, after the meeting, I would like to identify which were the main measures that we have asked policymakers to promote. Those measures are defined as financial measures and non-financial measures. In terms of financial measures, we would like to suggest and to provide direct cash grants to road transport company. We need to facilitate access to loan for covering variable costs. We need to facilitate delay to due dates for loan payments, extend payment deadlines, and facilitate reduction of insurance premium. We want to set up financial support programs for temporary unemployed, which affect the sector. In terms of non-financial measure, we want to establish green line for trucks to be implemented. Again, at the cross-border, we need to avoid queuing and we need to facilitate the transport of road freight sector. We want to prioritize collective passenger transport, and we want to design road transport worker as a key worker, giving them priority access to proper protection. We want also, as last point, to allow maximum flexibility on the interpretation of driving rules. We want that those measures should be coordinated between countries and trade blocks to avoid confusing operations or maintain a competitive and efficient transport landscape. Finally, as my closing note, I want to remind the driver in this period, road transport driver have risked their own health to bring food, medicine, and essential to supermarkets and hospitals everywhere. Now really the industry itself needs help, and we want to give the global economic recovery from COVID-19. Again, let me thank you to give the possibility to attend at the end of this discussion. Happy to support your Q&A question and happy to share the IO report on this specific item. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Aldo. Doy paso a continuación a Kate Blumberg.
Thank you very much, Aldo. Now we are going to Kate Blumberg from ICCT. We would like to know your vision about road freight operators in Argentina. How do you think that, from your experience, how Argentina can recover from this crisis? Kate, you have the floor.
And thank you to all of the presenters. This was very interesting. I think one of the things that I heard that struck most home to me from Gaston Jacquez was that this is a very heterogeneous sector, the freight transport, when we're thinking about trucks. Can you hear me all right? Is it, okay, good. And we need to think about it in two levels. So for the new, as Alan McKinnon mentioned, some of these freight fleets are doing quite well, urban delivery and others. And in those fleets that are doing very well, it's important to continue to demand the best, to require all new diesel vehicles be Euro 6, which that transition to the cleanest new technologies, which can reduce emissions of particulate matter and ozone precursors by more than 90%. Again, we know also that COVID-19 infections are related somewhat to air pollution, and Argentina has a relatively high risk of premature mortality already compared to other countries in the region. So moving to the cleanest new vehicles is really important. I think the other thing to remember is that about 12% of the vehicles in Argentina right now are over 25 years old. So whatever new vehicles we're investing in, we're purchasing now, could be in this fleet for a very long time. We need to be moving to the best quickly. For that part of that heterogeneous sector, the sector that is doing well, the purchasers of new vehicles are always the largest fleets, especially in markets like Argentina. So demanding the best is really critical. And in some portions, you could actually see benefits of moving directly to electric vehicles, as was mentioned. I'm not sure if it was by Julio, I'm sorry, but during the presentations, you can already reduce costs. There is, or perhaps it was Carla, that a way to reduce the total cost of operations of these vehicles, especially for urban delivery could be a move to electric. We're not as enthusiastic about these transitions as Julio was talking about. Biodiesel, HVO can actually have very high greenhouse gas emissions if you consider as well the indirect land use. Even if we are not cutting down forests, et cetera, there still can be high emissions. So I think we have to take those into consideration. Not as excited about natural gas as a transition. We think we can move to the cleanest diesel vehicles and also electric vehicles. For the other part of the heterogeneous sector, those older vehicles, I do think that moving to a scrappage program, I'm not always enthusiastic about scrappage programs because they might not have the kind of impact that we want, because these older vehicles aren't emitting as much. But in this case, where you need to give incentives to people, where you need to help them with their livelihood, this is a perfect opportunity for a scrappage program to get a lot of old vehicles off the road. Also, as Carla mentioned, driver training, and I'm sure that Julio Velasquez would be behind this as well. A good driver training program could help build the capacity for when the economy returns, help professionalize that fleet of drivers, and could be another very low cost but forward-looking way to move forward. One final thing I'll say is that I do think just putting labels on each of the existing vehicles that would allow you to to do local programs to restrict access, perhaps during certain times of day or to certain areas, to only the cleanest vehicles can help also transition and accelerate the fleet to the cleanest vehicles in the market, which we think is very important over the medium and longer term. So thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias, Kate. Antes de pasar al turno de preguntas y para dejar 1 minuto, 2 minutos de tiempo.
Thank you very much, Kate. Before going to the Q&A, to give some time for the participants to ask their questions, I would like to summarize everything that was said. I hope I included everything, and I believe that I would like to focus on economic recovery. In terms of Alan's speech, the decarbonization opportunities, the 5 initiatives towards decarbonization, reduction of road freight demand, the use of lower carbon vehicles, the increase of the use of trucks, increase of energy efficiency of vehicles, and energy sources with lower carbon consumption. These are all very interesting initiatives aligned with what Gaston Jacquez said in terms of the specific situation of Argentina right now, and all those plans and initiatives like having multi-modality with trucks and trains. Also, the proposal called Rango Verde by Julio Velasquez is also very good because it focuses on innovative measurements in terms of vehicles, compliance, and human resources. Carla's perspective, establishing this important link within logistics and social balance, the reduction of emissions, and the economic recovery depends on the supply chain. We need to understand transport within the specific connection of all the sectors, and therefore COVID presents an opportunity for decarbonization, but always taking into account the social balance. And I would like to take comments from the last 2 participants, Aldo and Kate. Aldo discussed the study on COVID and the impact on different sectors. And also this takes us to think on the keys in order to try and find opportunities for recovery and decarbonization in the sector. And in terms of Kate, all those perspectives, benefits of different measures as the incentives that she said in order to reconvert old vehicles, and having better steps that even though they might be little steps, we can go towards decarbonization in the medium term. I hope that we all reflected today on what the panelists said, and that in the short term, we can apply all these so that all these contributions can lead towards the reduction of emissions in transport and economic recovery. So without further ado, I would like to go into the Q&A session. I would like first to launch a question for Alan McKinnon that says the following. You said that there is a competition between the efficiency in road freight and their resilience in the supply chain. So what type of strategies or ideas could be added in this regard that could increase efficiency and resilience within the efforts being produced in the transport sector?
A very good question. 2 years ago, I chaired an ITF roundtable, which examined that specific topic, the interrelationship between resilience and efficiency in logistics operations. And some of the delegates argued that the two things were actually very well aligned, and it wasn't a trade-off, that these things could pull in the same direction. The traditional view is, however, that to maximize efficiency at a logistics level, and not simply for the road freight sector, you want to drive down inventory levels. So you want then to have frequent deliveries of small quantities to minimize inventory. You want to minimize redundancy across the sector as well, minimize the vehicles that you have to operate. And therefore, to some extent, there is obviously a conflict between the two things. I mean, it also depends how we define resilience here, because we tend to link it to risk and supply chain disruption. But I think one could say that the road freight sector as a whole tends to be a very resilient industry. Many people are expecting the road freight industry to rebound fairly rapidly, because the barriers to entry to the industry are very low. Very often when there's unemployment in other sectors, unemployed people buy secondhand trucks and enter the industry, so that although the capacity of the industry has reduced as a result of COVID, and we did hear from the contributor from IRU, how many trucking companies have gone bankrupt, it's likely that we will see them replaced by a new generation of trucking companies, maybe owner-drivers who will enter the industry. So in terms of the market competence and capacity of the industry, I think that will rebound and will be resilient. But I think in terms of the management of logistics, I still see there is a trade-off between efficiency as we conventionally define it, and also resilience. And of course, I haven't mentioned sustainability. The things you do to improve efficiency in the operation, like improving backloading of the vehicles and improving load factors, will also have a carbon benefit as well as having an efficiency benefit as well. So rather long answer, but I hope that helped to address the point that you made.
Ha sido muy clara, por favor.
You were very clear. The rest of the panelists, if you would like to make any comments, even though I am asking the question for a specific speaker, if you would like to answer, please do it. Now I would like to ask like a general question, which is the following. This is actually one of the comments from one of the participants, and he says that intermodality, the way it is explained in presentations and in the framework of the COVID, creates an epidemiological cluster. The truck drivers maybe are left aside while other modes are still working. So maybe it would be good to discuss what this epidemiological cluster is. Who would like to answer in the first place, or do you have any comments?
Alan McKinnon again. I'm not entirely sure what's meant by this. One possible definition is that in intermodality, obviously you've got a road feeder movement, and so the trucks then congregate at an intermodal terminal where the freight then gets transferred onto rail. So by this concept of a cluster, do they mean that truck drivers will be gathering then at these intermodal points? But I think generally you could say that...
I believe that what they mean is that the drivers are limited within close-by areas, but there are other goods that could go through borders, through other modes. So I think that this is related to the fact that maybe those goods could be transmitted the virus. I think that's what they're trying to mean. If you allow me, Susana, I would like to add something. There are some provinces in Argentina that within the measures in order to protect them from the viral circulation, they took areas for consolidation of loads. We believe that this is dangerous, and this is related to the comment, and we believe that there is a serious problem of agglomeration of people, and what they are saying is that people should go and with their individual cars to find their goods. So the problem would not be being in touch with the goods, but people being in touch with each other when they go to pick up their goods. So I believe that we should take this into account, because this is not specifically related to the drivers, but to people going and picking up their stuff.
Una pregunta,
Thank you very much.
Gaston.
I have a question directly for Gaston. The question is, from the federal government, I think that Kate actually mentioned this.
Que se habían iniciado en
What are you going to do with some previous projects? And also, what are you going to do with alternative fuels, biofuels, of the use of hydrogen technologies? Well, regarding the first part, we are trying to renew our fleet in order to improve our road freight system. This will help to improve the type of vehicles that we have, and the idea is to have more fluid transport in terms of having more modern engines. We are not working specifically with scrap metals, but as Minister Meoni said, the idea is if there are obsolete engines, we would like to leave them aside. There are some trucks in the country that have engines that are 40 years old and they are still circulating. So we are trying to develop plans together with the Ministries of Environment, Infrastructure and Production to see if we can improve this situation. And in terms of new technologies for production, we are using different types of structures in Argentina and fuels, because given the extension of our country, we are using many we are attending several areas. And this is why we believe that compressed natural gas would be a good option in Argentina. And also, this person asked about hydrogen production. And there's a question for Julio related to this. They wanted to know what is your opinion on the Canadian technology with hydrogen production for diesel engines, because they want to know if your association knows about this technology and maybe if this could be useful in Argentina. We are aware of this, and actually this is an option that we are considering for our transport, hydrogen. Our engineers believe that given the freights in Argentina, there are other options that might be better. In Argentina, we do have nuclear technology. Apart from the US, the only country in the region that has nuclear development is Argentina, and we could rectify hydrogen with our nuclear technology. Also, the projects in Canada, we read about them, and if there is someone interested, I would like for them to get in contact with us, because every proposal is welcome in order to try and fund higher efficiency and reduction of emissions. And I wanted to add something in terms of scrap metals. We still have a pilot program about this with several organizations in Argentina, and the idea is to try and send 3,000 units as scrap, and the idea is for them to be turned into new modalities in terms of use of energy. If the pandemic allows us to continue with the speed that we had, we are going to do it soon. There are several questions related to the use of less contaminant energies and alternate fuels. There is a question for Carla, and the question is, electric roads are a viable option in Latin America? Hydrogen, electric vehicles, and also if there are better solutions in order to increment efficiency like biofuels, multimodalism, other solutions that maybe halfway could be attractive. And also in Europe, let me tell you that the project that the EC is launching are very much related to electric technologies, but also they are trying to implement hydrogen plants. And actually in my region in Spain, there is a high bet on hydrogen when large companies are actually selling electric vehicles, and we don't see this being fostered at the national level, the use of hydrogen, but in some regions it is an option. So what is the perspective? This is a question for Carla, but if you have comments, please be free to make them. So what do you think we should do? Shall we go into the electric model, hydrogen, or what are other solutions that could be better? I don't know if I'm the right person to say if hydrogen or electric options, but as I said before, we have to take into account the combination of factors. We cannot be focusing only on vehicles because they will take some time. The thing with electric vehicles, we've seen how much time this took for individual vehicles, and now we know that electric trucks will have further delays. So we insist that there should be a framework in order to analyze the advantages and the possible combinations, at least for Latin America. In Europe, there are rich countries making interesting investment like this electric corridor that we hope we see soon in Germany. And Professor McKinnon could tell us a little bit more about that. But this definitely needs long distances and also large volumes of goods being transported, but that is the future. I do believe that the question is not so much related on which technology to choose, but if we are willing to do all this in order to go faster. And what Ms. Bloomberg said is crucial. If scrapping will allow Latin America to move forward, then let's do it. But stop talking about long-term futures if we are not even moving forward in the short term in those situations where we can really seize the opportunities or the opportunities given by the pandemic in order to find solutions in the short term for Latin America or Africa that maybe are not the same solutions as in Europe, but they will at least allow us to go into this path in a better way.
Susana? Is it
This is Kate Bloomberg again. Could I add to what Carla said, I do think that there, in some ways, we're not ready to decide what technology will win and where to invest. But there are cases where already electric vehicles are more cost effective over their lifetime. So if we can find sources of investment especially for buses, where you are refueling centrally, so you don't have to consider having charging infrastructure all over. And over the lifetime of the vehicles, the costs are already lower. So buses are a good example. The other one that's a great example is urban delivery fleets, which Alan was saying. These are, we know that this is surging, that there are more urban delivery. Again, these are a perfect drive cycle for electric vehicles. They're stop-start, they're short distances, they're relatively known routes. They're refueling again centrally, so we don't need charging infrastructure everywhere. So whereas private vehicles, electrification of private vehicles, I would not say is a good investment opportunity right now in Argentina, or a good thing to necessarily promote or spend your resources on. Looking to the private companies that are doing well to try and find ways to help them and to push them to invest in electrification can really do wonders. But these, as you know, the question was also natural gas, other kinds of things. We don't see a whole lot of benefit in these kinds of transitions because that's just going to prolong. But the eventual reduction in CO2 emissions and natural gas doesn't actually offer significant benefits. In some cases, it might actually have higher greenhouse gas emissions when you look at the total life cycle. So we do think that there are cases where you could move directly to electric vehicles. And all the rest, we need to move as quickly as possible to Euro 6 and ultra low sulfur diesel to make sure that the fleet is going in the right direction.
Could I add something, Susanna, as well? I'd agree with what's been said by the two previous contributors. In Germany, there are fairly thorough studies been done of the right sort of decarbonisation pathways for long distance trucking, and electrification of the highway has come out as the most cost-effective way of doing that. Incidentally, hydrogen comes out as the least cost-effective way, because you waste a lot of energy in the hydrogen supply chain from electrolysis through to the wheel of the vehicle. But the other thing is, people dismissed using batteries to power long-haul trucks because they thought they'd be simply too heavy. I mean, there were reports that for a truck with a payload of 20 tons, you might have to have a 15-ton battery. However, there have been significant improvements in the technology here, and they reckon you could run a long-haul truck over, say, 500 miles with a battery weighing maybe only 4 to 6 tons. So that makes that potentially commercially viable as well. But I think the thing that has to be said is there's no one-size-fits-all. You know, one will be tailoring the technology to the particular logistics operation and also to the particular country as well. But what does worry me is there's such disagreement on this issue at the moment, which is such a fundamental issue, and yet we really have to decarbonize road freight very quickly. So we've got to resolve some of these issues as fast as we can.
Yes, Alan, I would like to complement what you said, if I may, Susanna. This is Aldo. I would like I would like to complement what the speaker said before. Definitely, there is no one solution fits for all. We have to think in a broader scenario. Also, we have to promote in Europe, for instance, the use of solutions already available, such as the high-capacity vehicle that are at national level promoted, but that are not possible to be used at international levels. High-capacity vehicle offer is an immediate solution available, offer a huge important fuel economy reduction, and also the use of alternative fuel can be seen as a pathway to the hydrogen as a long-term scenario. We don't see application for electric vehicle for long haulage because we don't want to sacrifice load capacity of vehicle to battery. Definitely we see battery application for urban delivery or short distribution range. Thanks.
Muchísimas gracias, Aldo. En relación con esto, yo creo que tenemos...
Thank you very much, Aldo, and I think that we have time for 1 or 2 question tops. And aligned with what you are saying in terms of long distance transport and emissions, we have one of the questions by one of the participants in terms of the use of bike trains, if they are safe, if they really reduce emissions, and if they are accepted by society. In my experience in Spain, where they are called bio-trailers, the routes are very much restricted. and they are very specific with specific rules in terms of safety and security, but these by trains or road train do reduce emissions. However, there are other problems, the lack of training in drivers and how they are very much limited in terms of their routes. This is for Gaston, but maybe there are other opinions in the panel. Yes, I totally agree. Susana, just a second, please. Yes, we agree, and our by train or road train infrastructure is very much limited as in Spain. We do believe that CO2 is reduced. However, with our structure in Argentina, we cannot have the right conditions for this type of road trains. We could do something about scalability, though, in order to reduce gas emissions. In terms of by trains or road trains, there are bridges that are not still ready for those high loads. And I believe that in Argentina, we are moving more towards the change in scalability and not in terms of using road trains. Also, in terms of cost, because these road trains could be very expensive and this would be very far from our reality in Argentina. And in terms of scalability, it would be very good to do this. But as I said, by trains are not an option in Argentina. And we believe that multimodality is the best choice for us, not for standard situations. But we do believe that multimodality will be very good because it would integrate all the different modes of transport. Very good. I don't know if you have any comments on road trains or if we should move to the last question. Yes, I would like to say something from the point of view of business and investment because I am representing business people here. And I believe that scalability is an option that comes first before road trains or by trains in terms of being more efficient in the use of tons. This has been very positive. In some cases, by trains or road trains might be a solution, but the great obstacles that we have with this type of mode is the infrastructure. The number of bridges in Argentina that we have in Argentina and provinces such La Pampa, where a truck has to go and make a detour of 300 kilometers because bridges cannot hold their weight. So I believe that in Argentina, and actually we are already having this scalability option, but I believe that we should have more investment in infrastructure in order to accompany this process. Thank you very much. I have a last question, and it's the following. Having the priorities clear for a long time in the scientific community, how do you think that we can reach minimum consensus between decision makers in governments who so far have not seen this priority as strategies, but just only as a green agenda, which is PC? So I would like to say something here in terms of how we all agree on these priorities, but I would like to say something here in terms of how we should set regulations. For example, we talk about digitalization and how technology is moving so fast, but still we see how those laws regulating the use of technology are going very slow, and in some cases they become obstacles for the application of that technology. And I am talking about technology, but maybe this could be the case for any improvement for transport or decarbonization. So What are the possibilities in this case for Argentina? How do you see this topic? Do you believe that this is seen as a strategy and not as a green agenda? And how are regulations moving forward in terms of the implementation of measures in order to safeguard transport, decarbonization, and the implementation of these new technologies? Who would like to answer this one? Maybe Gaston could break the ice and give us his point of view from the ministry and how they are perceiving the scientific priorities. Can you hear me? Because I am having some connection problems. Yes, we can hear you, yes. We can hear you, Gaston. Now, Gaston, we can hear you, yes. I am having some internet problems, so I didn't hear the question very well. But what I want to say is the following. We are working with our Ruta log, and the idea is to classify the different vehicles with different stickers so that this could... I'm sorry, we have no more audio. Now we see you, but we cannot hear you. Now we don't hear you. Can I answer? Yes, Julio. In our institution and in the sector, we are working together with, I'm sorry? We're working together with the state, and one of the topics that we are paying attention to, and actually we built a laboratory for vehicle technology because we are trying to understand what type of vehicle is necessary. And in order to do this, we are working with two applications which are crucial. One of them is telemetry. They are connected. All the vehicles that we are using are linked through telemetry in terms of consumption, position, etc. And also, this is very good because we can have information on how drivers are driving, and I believe that this technology is crucial because also it will give us information on what types of vehicles we need from now on, because it's not only about the energy, but also the emissions, the relationship between, or the ratio between power and weight that we need. And I heard about what is happening in Germany, but in Argentina, the average distance is 1,200 kilometers. So for us to electrify 1,200 kilometers of highways would be a huge challenge in terms of infrastructure. So this is the road that we are going through. Thank you very much. Gaston, we lost you before and we gave the floor to Julio. Can you please continue? I'm sorry, I had connection problems. Supporting what Julio says, he's working a lot on this topic, but first what we need to do is to be honest about what type of vehicles we have. And after knowing what type of vehicles we have, we'll know what to do. And the thing is that the vehicles that we currently have are so heterogeneous that we cannot define one specific measure. So first, as I said, we need to be honest about the type of vehicles that we have. And as Julio said, after the thorough analysis of each one of the parts, we'll be able to really define a plan. Thank you, and I am sorry for my connection problems, Susana. Okay, thank you very much. So now I would like to thank all the participants, the members of the panels, and the organizers. It was a true pleasure to be here moderating this session. And let me remind you that the next session will be on July 16th. It will be about trains, and you can obtain more information entering this website that you see on screen right now. And of course, you can use social media in order to disseminate this event. Thank you very much. And now I will give the floor to Joshua for his final remarks. Thank you very much, Susana, for your excellent moderation throughout the event. Thanks again to all the panelists, the participants that were here today, and especially from the ITF, we would like to thank the other co-organizers of this event, and specifically the staff of the Ministry of Transport in Argentina that, even though they might have had some connection difficulties, they were able to participate yesterday and today, and will keep on working together the next weeks. So thank you all very much. I hope you have a nice day, and that was it. Thank you very much. Thank you.